Welcome to 1984. The world wasn't quite what George Orwell had predicted, but there was still a whole lot going on. The first Apple Macintosh personal computer was on sale for a cool $2,500, which probably seemed worth it after that killer Super Bowl commercial by Ridley Scott inspired by the Orwell classic. It was the year the Summer Olympics were held in Los Angeles and boycotted by the Soviet Union. The year that the US was guaranteed 4 more years of Ronald Reagan after his landslide re-election. The year of Cabbage Patch Kids and Crockett and Tubbs. Bruce broke out with Born in the USA, Prince crooned about Purple Rain, and Madonna scandalized the world with her Like a Virgin performance at the very first MTV Video Awards. Virgin Atlantic Airways took its first flight, and the immortal game Tetris was born in Moscow. On the big screen, it's the year of the Terminator, Electric Boogaloo, The Karate Kid, and Ghostbusters.
To be good, for goodness sake.
The year everyone began having nightmares of Freddy Krueger while saying goodbye, temporarily, to Jason Voorhees. Overall, the movie business was booming, but a change was in the air, and things at the local multiplex were about to be altered in a big way. Hollywood's favorite son, Steven Spielberg, found himself crossing the line and bringing the industry with him in the summer of 1984. The movie world would never be the same. Much like everything else that happens in Hollywood, the PG-13 rating is thanks to none other than Steven Spielberg. Not much goes down in this town without Spielberg's knowledge or say-so, and he had a direct hand in creating the rating that is now associated with many of the biggest films of all time. After the 1975 release of Jaws, Spielberg was catapulted into the spotlight as a helmer of incredibly popular entertainment, thanks to his uncanny ability to combine family-friendly nostalgia with bone-chilling terror. The stuff in some of those early Spielberg films is still so intense that it's crazy to look back on them and realize they're only rated PG. Imagine the fear I felt seeing Bruce the Shark eating a small child alive. It had such an impact that I'm still overly cautious when it comes to getting into the ocean. That alone is worth an R rating. Yet that considerably scary movie went out into the world of a PG-rated meat eater. And of course, it became the biggest movie of all time in the process, at least for a couple of years. In the wake of the massive success of 1981's first Indiana Jones adventure, Raiders of the Lost Ark, a sequel was a no-brainer. Not unlike its predecessor, the follow-up would be inspired by the serial adventures of the 1930s and 40s, though this one would be a bit darker in tone. The franchise's godfathers, Spielberg and George Lucas, didn't simply want to repeat Raiders, so instead of Nazis, Indy would be battling a human sacrifice cult in India. Lucas was convinced that the second chapter had to be a dark film, much in the way that Empire Strikes Back is the bleakest film in the original Star Wars trilogy. In addition, both Lucas and Spielberg were going through serious personal issues at the same time. George was in the middle of a divorce from his wife of many years, Marcia Lucas, while Spielberg's 3-year relationship with music exec Kathleen Carey was also ending. Both men were suitably depressed. And Lucas later attributed the grim tone of Temple of Doom to the men's relationship failures, admitting that neither of them were in quote-unquote good moods when they decided to do an edgier Indiana Jones. Even the first film's screenwriter, Lawrence Kasdan, was supremely turned off by the ideas being generated for Temple of Doom, refusing to work on it and saying on the record that he thought it was very ugly and mean-spirited. And indeed, if you saw the film when you were a kid like myself, some of those ugly images were burned into your head. Pun intended. Temple of Doom often plays more like a horror film than a swashbuckling adventure, not only assaulting our heroes with an assortment of creepy crawlies and the most unappetizing meal of all time, but some severe violence and images of child abuse are on display seemingly without stop. The entire second half of Temple of Doom is an intense freak-out, culminating fittingly with a sequence where bad guys fall to their deaths and get eaten by ferocious crocodiles. And that's a lighthearted moment. We had survived Spielberg's dark side before. If we could handle Poltergeist, we could handle just about anything. But this was indeed quite a lot to stomach, especially when seeing it in the theater, where the foreboding Temple of Doom looked and sounded quite a bit like hell on earth. It may have a happy ending, but Indy and his friends went through trials that made the wrath of God look like a cakewalk. Some folks were thoroughly outraged by Temple of Doom. A review in People magazine referred to the second half of the film as a relentless, tedious stream of graphic brutality. It went so far as to claim Spielberg and Lucas had violated the trust of moviegoers, who went to their pictures expecting a much more lighthearted time. The Washington Post called it corrupt at its core, and a brutal disappointment that was for barbarians, not fans of the first indie. Ouch. Spielberg recalled how parents were adamant that Temple of Doom should have been rated R, but he disagreed with that assessment. At the time, he even defended some of the bleak content. He's quoted as saying, "It's not Temple of Roses, it's called Temple of Doom." Well played, Mr. Spielberg. Still, he understood where he might have stepped over the line and decided a change in the system was necessary, but he wouldn't fully charge forth with the notion until a few weeks after the release of Temple of Doom, when another Amblin-produced horror show, Gremlins, came out. That film had been marketed as a fun, family-friendly creature feature in the same vein as Spielberg's E.T., hiding the overt horror elements in Joe Dante's twisted Christmas nightmare. But beyond the cuddly surface of Gizmo and Anytown, USA, lurked a heart of demented darkness. Suddenly, we kids who'd seen that dude get his heart ripped out of his chest in Temple of Doom were watching snarling, malevolent gremlins terrorize a quiet suburb. Let's face it, while in hindsight a double feature of Temple of Doom and Gremlins might seem like an awesome proposition, but it was a hell of a traumatic 1-2 punch for myself. But Spielberg heard the words of parents who thought that these movies were getting too grim for their own good. In fact, he felt personally responsible. The writing was on the wall that this kind of entertainment was getting a bit more grown up than the children's films of the past. So the director sought a compromise. He went to Jack Valenti, at the time the president of the MPAA, and suggested a rating somewhere between PG and R. "I created the problem, and I also supplied the solution," said the director with perhaps some pride some years later, and it's quite accurate indeed. Valenti agreed to the terms and came up with the PG-13, although apparently PG-12 and PG-14 were both considered. The rating was initially intended as an added warning to parents that the movie they were considering taking their little ones to had some more mature content, or as Spielberg put it in an interview, some extra hot sauce in the material. As it was, PG-13 stood for Parental Guidance Suggested. Some material may be inappropriate for children under 13. So only a few weeks after the uproar over the violent content in Temple of Doom and Gremlins, the MPAA now had a new rating to play with for movies that had that extra hot sauce, but were still too benign for an R rating. The first movie technically given a PG-13 was the Gary Marshall comedy The Flamingo Kid starring Matt Dillon. But that film didn't come out until December of '84, so the first official release with the rating was John Milius's High Schoolers vs. Soviets war drama, Red Dawn, which was released in August of '84, just 2 months after Gremlins. Red Dawn had its share of controversies, and at the time was considered one of the most violent American movies ever released, regardless of the rating. A week after Red Dawn, the world's second PG-13 movie was released, the trippy sci-fi horror flick Dreamscape, starring Dennis Quaid, and somewhat ironically, Temple of Doom's own Kate Capshaw. Dreamscape has some nightmarish imagery that certainly warrants its rating, leaving you with the impression that its creation wasn't such a bad idea at all. Both Red Dawn and Dreamscape were modest box office successes, further proving that PG-13 would not necessarily be a detriment to the business in any profound way. The next genre film to release in '84 with a PG-13 was the Valley Girls in the Apocalypse horror comedy Night of the Comet, a harmless enough flick that certainly has its share of unsettling visuals, but nothing so harrowing as those Spielberg flicks. And this is easily one of those formative movies for us 80s kids, giving us perhaps our first carefree look at the end of the world through the eyes of a couple of girls who just want to have fun. It's safe to presume we all had crushes on Catherine Mary Stewart and Kelly Maroney after that, as there was just something special about seeing cute girls breeze through an apocalyptic wasteland using their charm, wits, and the occasional machine gun. A month after Comet, on December 14th, two very different sci-fi movies with the rating hit theaters. David Lynch's Dune, with the fantasy adventure getting slapped with a PG-13 for, I guess, excessive worm riding, and Michael Crichton's Runaway, which tackles one of the writer's favorite topics, technology run amok. That film gets a PG-13, mostly because it seems wrong to feature a creepy Gene Simmons in a PG movie. Still, it has some intense robot violence that definitely turned me off of mechanical spiders forever. With 1984 in the books, the stage was set for a future filled with boundary-pushing PG-13 movies in all genres. But since these are horror movie memories, let's look at some of the more notable genre flicks to wear the PG-13 badge. 1985 would of course be the first full year of PG-13 movies, and intriguingly enough, two of the earlier ones that year came courtesy of the same producer, legendary schlockmeister Charles Band, who wanted to branch out beyond adult horror fare. January 85 saw the release of Ghoulies, which is often seen as a Gremlins ripoff, though it was in production in early 84 before the release of the Dante film, and it might have come out even earlier had producer Charles Band not run out of money in the middle of production, causing a delay in shooting. Warner Brothers, who was banking on Gremlins to be a big hit, briefly sued Band's company in an effort to get them to shut down permanently, but David beat Goliath in that battle. Ultimately, Ghoulies wasn't quite nasty enough to warrant an R rating, but it has plenty of bite.
They were fun, they were ridiculous, whether the Ghoulies were coming out of toilets or killing people in a funhouse. They were just ridiculous and they looked ridiculous, and I think that it allowed you to laugh at the horror as opposed to be upset and disturbed by it. So you watch Cannibal Holocaust and you're disturbed, you're disgusted, you feel revolt in what you're looking at, versus something like a Chud or a Critters, and you're kind of just laughing. It's just fun. It's just fun. Popcorn entertainment.
Also released in 85 with the rating was the Band-produced Trancers, the time-traveling sci-fi action flick starring Tim Thomerson as the awesomely named Jack Death. Just a year later, Band courted the PG-13 again with Troll, and talk about upsetting movies. This is one that you cannot fathom taking small children to just because it's so grotesque and off-putting. Never been a fan of the little weirdos that populate this dingy film. Notable PG-13 releases the first full year of the rating's existence include Stephen King's Cat Eye, which, wouldn't you know it, also has a damn troll in it, George Miller's Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, the outer space saga Enemy Mine, and another Steven Spielberg production, Young Sherlock Holmes, which, yes, has yet another disturbing human sacrifice sequence, as well as one very weird killer pastry scene that surely tanked cannoli sales for a significant stretch of time. Movies aimed at kids were certainly getting weirder thanks to the PG-13, and directors started to push the boundaries of what they were allowed to do. Gremlins fever was evidently still in the air, as 1986 brought us a new breed of miniature terrors in the form of Critters, which proudly wore its inspirations on its sleeve. John Carpenter also released his first PG-13 movie in '86 in the form of Big Trouble in Little China, a movie with ample sense of humor and adventure, and of course, some freaky weird stuff in it that can't be unseen. 1987, however, was a great year for the rating, thanks to two movies in particular, what I consider a dream double feature: Fred Decker's ode to Universal Monster movies, The Monster Squad, and the very spooky The Gate, which, you guessed it, has a horde of disturbing little monsters petrifying the film's characters and audience members alike. Of all the tiny cretins tossed at us throughout this decade, these guys were easily the most terrifying, and the movie remains a genuinely creepy experience, no matter what age you are.
You watch a movie like The Gate, which I just showed my son recently, and my son, who's only 8 years old, was rolling his eyes being like, "This is terrible, look at these, this is the worst visual effects I've ever seen." And he's, of course, referring to the claymation, like Harryhausen-esque little dudes.
Of special note, the Jaws franchise finally got a PG-13 to call its own, with Jaws: The Revenge. But if you can't say something nice about a movie, well, you know. Poltergeist 2 nabbed the PG-13 its successor surely deserved thanks to some really icky imagery. And Indiana Jones got his first PG-13 when Last Crusade was released in 1989, and reminded us to choose our drinks wisely, lest we suffer the consequences. Intriguingly, the PG-13 still gets some blank stares from horror fans even today.
I think one of the things that is missing is that R certificate. Please stop making horror films for PG-12.
Even though in recent years we've seen plenty of movies with the rating that are effective and scary, like The Ring, Insidious, The Sixth Sense, or even A Quiet Place. At the end of the day, movies were never the same after Spielberg and Amblin mortified families back in '84, and the business is better off this way. While we all love an R-rated horror flick, we should know by now that the PG-13 label is not one to run screaming away from, because even some of the PG-rated ones still scare the hell out of us. And there's nothing better than that. Let's take a brief detour into the classic tropes of the genre to establish the similarities and to look at how their simplicity has helped the subgenre endure for so long. What's so appealing about the subgenre are the endless variations on the stalk and slash formula that are possible, but the gore-splattered heart of them remains the same. Just consider John Carpenter's original Halloween movie and how its longevity still entices movie fans to cinemas to this day. Albeit to slightly diminishing returns, in terms of quality at least. Halloween was the blueprint for how to make a slasher movie. It's a film that took cues from older horror movies, such as Psycho and Black Christmas, as well as other more niche titles such as Mario Bava's A Bay of Blood. Halloween showed budding horror filmmakers that if they had a good premise, a young, cheap, but talented cast, plus a gimmick that could be franchisable, then you had yourself a slasher movie. Many films followed that simple blueprint, and when The Terminator hit cinemas in 1984, it was at the height of the slasher frenzy.
Of course, I'm biased, but I think The Terminator stands as another perfect example of genre filmmaking. Everything about it. The cinematography, the storytelling, the effects, the performances. Jim Cameron is a master, and that is one of his greatest masterpieces.
What we all love so much about this crazy industry we find ourselves often immersed in is that film and people's opinion of it is largely subjective. So if you have a conversation with your pals, family members, or colleagues and mention that The Terminator is a slasher movie, the response you may get is,
"Get the f out of here! No, I cannot, it's serious!"
Which I guess is a fair assumption to make. On the surface, it's an action and science fiction movie. However, if you consider the evidence to the contrary, then the movie is essentially a slasher flick. The first and most obvious argument for this is in Arnie's seemingly unstoppable villain, the T-800. And then there's Linda Hamilton's protagonist, Sarah Connor, who is essentially the stereotypical final girl. When we first meet her, she's working a dead-end job as a waitress. She isn't exactly killing it on the dating scene, and is then pursued by a killing machine from the future, because her destiny is to give birth to the leader of the human resistance.
His name is Connor. John Connor. Your son, Sarah.
She goes from timid waitress to Terminator-crushing heroine across the trajectory of her story arc, and follows in the similarly badass footsteps of characters such as Ellen Ripley and Laurie Strode. On the other hand, however, is Arnie's T-800, a terrifying and unstoppable killing machine that obliterates everyone in its path, including a police station full of poor, unsuspecting cops. Throughout the narrative, he makes his way to Sarah Connor by effortlessly picking off his targets one by one. Much like horror icons Michael Myers, Leatherface, or Jason Voorhees before him, one of the most recognizable arcs for the protagonist in slasher movies is the gradual, horrific realization that somebody is coming to kill them in a gratuitously bloody way.
You're dead, honey.
In the Terminator, most of the personal information and records about people are destroyed in the future. You know, the same future that Kyle Reese is sent back from to protect Sarah Connor. So therefore, all the T-800 has to go on is Sarah Connor's name and the knowledge that she will become the mother of the resistance leader that fights the machines. The T-800 looks up all known Sarah Connors in the area and systematically slaughters them, leaving an impressive and bloody trail of corpses in just the opening third of the movie.
I saw the Terminator opening weekend 3 times in Framingham, Massachusetts. And one of the things I loved about the Terminator is that it was just so relentless. The thing about the Terminator is that it is so propulsive in its storytelling. If you imagine Michael Biehn, he's got her in the car, and you get an entire 2-minute scene of exposition. It's just pure backstory, talked while there's a car chase and guns blazing. It's the most perfect vehicle for exposition ever because you're in a vehicle hearing the exposition and you're moving the story forward. So I think in a lot of ways the metronomic precision of the screenplay was the thing that really resonated with me, and it made me find a copy of the script to read it because I wanted to see what I saw on screen, how was it represented on page, and that kind of started my sort of initial interest in not just screenwriting but just how things are written to be turned into movies. And I have a very large and a disturbing collection of screenplays that sit in storage.
As well as the seemingly unstoppable force of nature that is Arnie's T-800, the movie also displays other classic tropes of the genre, such as the classic sex equals death trope seen in countless other slashers. Carpenter's Halloween is a good example, as is Friday the 13th, just to name 2 films. And the consensus is that if you have sex in a slasher movie, you're gonna go out with a bang, if you pardon the pun. Now, the reason behind this particular trope has been discussed for decades. Are these sexually active teens being punished for having sex? Or is it more that they're simply distracted by intercourse to see the lumbering psychopath that's about to gut them like a fish? Whatever the motive for the killer and filmmakers is during these scenes, which, to be honest, may have been an easy way to entice teens into multiplexes with the promise of some sex and nudity, the Terminator features a scene during the T-800's hunt for Sarah Connor, right out of the slasher playbook. After her date calls to ditch her, she leaves her roommate Ginger to spend some quality time with her boyfriend and heads out to the movies alone. In classic slasher tradition, she hears a news report about the dead Sarah Connors and understandably begins to freak out. After doing some very 80s research by sifting through a phone book, remember those? She realizes that she's next in order on the T-800's shit list, ditches her slice of double pepperoni, and gets the hell out of there. Upon leaving, she notices a creepy guy following her, who we know is just good old Kyle Reese there to save the poor lady, and heads into the nightclub Tech Noir to escape. Meanwhile, back at the apartment, a post-coitus Ginger and her fella are brutally murdered by a hulking Arnie in full-on Michael Myers mode, throwing Ginger's unlucky boyfriend around the room before fatally throwing him through the door and shooting Ginger in the back a couple of times. It's a shame that Ginger and her boyfriend didn't realize that they were in a badass slasher movie. Otherwise, they would have been running, not getting busy. But that's the trope, folks, so just go with it. The scene displays all the classic hallmarks of a slasher movie, from the sex to the T-800's hulking and menacing presence, to Ginger not hearing her fella being murdered as she's gone off to the kitchen for a snack with her headphones on, all the way to the killer finding out about Sarah's whereabouts from her desperate plea for help on the answering machine. This leads the T-800 straight to Tech Noir, where we get a full-on action scene that still has shades of a classic slasher about it, before Kyle comes out with the now iconic,
Come with me if you want to live.
The Terminator. That was such a great cinematic piece of history. And well, first of all, Schwarzenegger being just the huge icon that he is, and that even furthered his icon status for sure. And if anyone should be walking around naked on film, it's him. And I think when we also had some time travel involved in Terminator. So I'm a big fan of time travel. In fact, one of my favorite 80s movies is Somewhere in Time. Super not in the horror genre, mind you. It's more of a romantic date night film, but it does involve time travel, so that always intrigues me. What can we, if we travel in time, can we affect what happens in the past or the future, or vice versa? That question is like a big mind blower for me. So here he is coming from the future to stop something from the past so that the future will change. And that alone was enough to get me excited. And then he's a machine that gets more revealed as the movie progresses. So again, AI, robotics, the future. What does it hold? I think we're all intrigued by that. And will machines become sentient? Age-old question. And as we sit here this year, in this time and era, it's looking more and more possible, which scares the crap out of me.
You could argue that the basic but most essential requirements for a slasher film are the killer, the body count, the methods of murder, the focus of the movie, and in some cases, the setting. The tropes we mentioned earlier in the video are also essential to the overall enjoyment of the movie, and alongside the sex and death and the final girl trope, any slasher movie worthy of the name should also highlight some useless cops and unhelpful grown-ups, a cool mask, or at least an unmasking of sorts, cruel and unusual deaths, the seemingly dead killer's resurrection, and the reveal of the antagonist. However, does the Terminator deliver on all of these slasher tropes? Well, let's take a closer look at the evidence. The killer is fairly obvious, as we all know some merciless T-800 action, and the body count is incredibly high, with a large number of cops killed in the police station raid. The method of murder is a little murkier, however, and while it's not quite as inventive as more traditional slasher films, we still get some great kills. Arnie's T-800 gleefully shoots a whole number of unfortunate cops and other Sarah Connors. And we also get a heart ripped out, a cop's head being fatally bashed against his car, and of course, Sergeant Wright being run down by a car. The cops here at least try to be helpful to poor stalked Sarah Connor, but they are ultimately pretty useless, as is the rest of the more adult cast, Kyle Reese aside. Now, when it comes to the cool mask, the Terminator doesn't necessarily fit the bill here exactly. However, there is indeed an unmasking of sorts, as the T-800, fresh from being engulfed in a fiery semi-truck explosion, stumbles out of the wreckage and collapses, but not before the Terminator's endoskeleton rises from the flames and gives chase.
And Jim approached my father, Stan Winston, with this brilliant concept art and a brilliant script, and Stan knew that he had found a fellow innovator in Jim and signed on to do the Terminator effects. When the film was originally presented to Stan, Jim did not consider building a full-size endoskeleton. Once all the skin is ripped off and you see the full endoskeleton, all those sequences were going to be achieved through stop-motion animation. But Stan convinced Jim that he could get a lot of his shots with a full-sized robot. And so Stan and his team did that. They built full-size robot, half bodies, insert heads, as well as all the makeup effects that was to go on Arnold Schwarzenegger. And that all came together to create one of the most iconic sci-fi horror characters in movie history, the Terminator.
It's an extremely cool and endlessly iconic moment that fits nicely into the seemingly dead killer's resurrection trope. We also get the obligatory, and of course premature, celebratory embrace between Sarah and Kyle. At the same time, final girl Sarah completes her cool character arc by crushing the T-800 in a hydraulic press. The ending is pure sci-fi horror and ties in nicely with the slasher genre by showing the T-800 stopping at nothing to kill its target. Its hand is almost around her throat just before she can finally defeat it.
You're terminated, fucker.
Like other characters from classic slasher films, the T-800 is impossible to stop. Throughout the movie, it strides from location to location, shrugging off bullets and knife wounds with minimal damage. And when it does get its head banged up, it simply sets about repairing itself.
The Terminator, having been involved in the Terminator franchise a little bit, Terminator Genesis with Arnold, but the original Terminator the whole model of it is a slasher film. You know, the Terminator, how he behaves, what he does. It just has a great storyline and a love story at its core, which is why I like it more than T2, because I think that's it. You know, the Michael Biehn love story is what grounds that entire, you know, and Linda Hamilton love story is what grounds the entire franchise. It's, you know, it's a great slasher monster movie that would just, with this killer robot coming after you, which is, could be Michael Myers, could be Jason, could be any one of them. It is exactly that. It's just so well done, and the story has such rich textures, because Cameron is, you know, James Cameron is a pretty amazing filmmaker. So, you know, that I would, yeah, hands down say the original Terminator is a horror movie. And I think part of the problem with its subsequent sequels, and not T2, but why so many of them have not worked, is because each one of them gets more and more expensive and refuses to acknowledge those roots.
It shouldn't come as a surprise that the Terminator bears more than just a passing resemblance to some of the more popular slasher horror flicks at the time. Director James Cameron, who began his career in horror with Piranha 2: The Spawning, went on record to express his admiration for what John Carpenter did with Halloween in 1978, and his effective way of filming on a shoestring budget that he would look to replicate on the Terminator, saying that, "My contemporaries were all doing slasher horror movies. John Carpenter was the guy I idolized the most. He made Halloween for $30,000 or something. That was everyone's break-in dream, to do a stylish horror movie. It was a very slasher film type image, and it really was the launching pad for the story." Cameron has also said that he shot the Terminator as a tech noir movie, the name for a genre he coined himself, and also the name of the nightclub in the film, dismissing it as a mere horror film or even a slasher. In our opinion though, Mr. Cameron, we think it most definitely bears all the necessary hallmarks of a slasher movie. And as kids, that was one of the first things that we noticed while watching the film. I hadn't had that much awareness of too many slashers by the time the Terminator was released on VHS. However, I'd seen enough of the genre to recognize that the great hulking brute that Arnie played in the T-800 was reminiscent of the masked horror icons that were popular at the time. We even watched the movie at a friend's parents' house as part of their birthday party, only for said boring parents to fast forward through the sex scenes and anything construed to be too kinky. Yeah, that's right, they were fine with the kids watching people getting brutally murdered, but the nudity, even partial on screen, oh no. Talk about some killjoys. So what's your take on the Terminator and the evidence that we presented here to support it as more than just tech noir, but also a badass slasher flick? It's undeniably one of the coolest, most iconic films ever put to celluloid. But in my humble opinion, it also kicks ass as a slasher.
Gremlins. Directed by Joe Dante. Coming this summer.
Many of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s could almost consider Steven Spielberg to be one of our babysitters. Hours of our childhoods were spent enjoying films that he brought into the world. He warmed our hearts with E.T. and thrilled us with the Indiana Jones movies. And for many of us, he opened the door to get into the horror genre, giving us nightmares with the likes of Duel and Jaws. His producing credits include Poltergeist, The Goonies, Back to the Future, The Land Before Time. In 1984, he was responsible for both Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom and the gateway horror film Gremlins. And some families expected it to be about a cute, cuddly, furry creature, and it is. But they didn't expect the little green rampaging monsters that spawn from that furry creature.
There's a little theme going on in our 80s movies that they really did the light and dark mix very well, and Gremlins is another example of that.
I think the kitchen scene was hilarious, though, when they're trying to, like, what do we do with these things? They're crawling all over the place. So kitchen appliances became our friend. And I remember a theater full of people guffaw laughing when one exploded in the microwave and where one got chopped up by the blender.
First, a bit of a history lesson. The idea of mischievous gremlins was around for about 60 years before screenwriter Chris Columbus started writing about them. It first came about in the 1920s when members of the Royal Air Force would blame mechanical issues on the little creatures. People in the military were still talking about gremlins during World War II. This is why in 1943, we got both a Roald Dahl book called The Gremlins, which was about the title characters joining forces with the Air Force to battle Nazis. Yeah, that's real. And the Bugs Bunny cartoon Falling Hair, in which that rascally rabbit meets something that beats it in the rascal department, a gremlin that tries to wreak havoc at an army field and on a bomber plane.
Gremlin. What a fairy tale.
Fast forward a few decades, aspiring filmmaker Chris Columbus was trying to sleep in his mouse-infested apartment, and while hearing the mice moving around in the darkness, the legendary Gremlins came to mind.
Look, I've always vacillated between mainstream horror and sort of underground or regional horror, but I love Gremlins because there's such a sense of anarchy to it. There's an underbelly of complete mayhem in that movie that I think belies its commercial success and its commercial intent. The darkness, and of course earlier drafts of the script were much, much darker, and they leavened it to make it a little bit more palatable. But one of the things I think that Gremlins served, especially for an 80s audience, and especially for kids, is that it became a gateway movie to more provocative and pushing the boundaries horror. I think there are several movies along the decade that really became that off-ramp to go to a place if it really tickled that interest and that fancy, that you would allow you to explore the kinds of movies that it suggested existed and that you could go find and prove that they really did exist.
He was inspired to write a story that begins with a man buying a gift for his son in a Chinese market. This gift is a new pet, a strange, furry little creature called a mogwai.
What?
I don't know, some Chinese word.
The name means devil in Cantonese, but this thing seems pretty harmless, and it's adorable. Its owners must follow 3 simple rules: keeping it out of sunlight because bright light can kill it, don't get it wet because when a mogwai gets wet, it will multiply with new mogwais popping out, and do not feed it after midnight because a mogwai that eats after midnight will metamorphose into a hideous maniacal monster. You know, a gremlin. Just in time for Christmas, young bank teller Billy Peltzer gets his mogwai, which he names Gizmo. Then he quickly fails to follow those rules. Soon there's a horde of gremlins causing death and destruction in his hometown of Kingston Falls. Columbus let his imagination run wild while he was crafting the script, because he never expected the movie to actually get made. He intended to show the script as a writing sample to prove that he could write something interesting. So he wrote scenes that would be incredibly difficult to bring to the big screen. Scenes with a whole lot of monsters causing trouble, and he wrote it with a very dark tone. The gremlins massacre and even consume townspeople. Heck, they even eat Billy's dog. They decapitate his mother, sending her severed head bouncing down a flight of stairs. When Columbus sent his script out, it didn't just receive the attention that he sought. It got more positive response than he ever could have dreamed of. And it ended up in the hands of Steven Spielberg, who wanted to make it, but only producing the film with someone else directing. Suddenly, Columbus found himself doing rewrites of his script for one of the biggest filmmakers in the whole industry. During these revisions, Gremlins lost a lot of its darkness and gore. The edges were softened, the body count was lowered, and the mom and dog were spared. What started as something that only hardcore horror hounds would enjoy became something much more accessible, a creature feature with heart and a sense of humor. Spielberg briefly considered hiring Tim Burton to direct the film based on the quality of his short films, but he was hesitant because Burton just didn't have any feature experience yet. So he turned to a director who first caught his attention with the Jaws cash-in, Piranha, and continued to impress with his werewolf movie, The Howling. That man, Joe Dante. As great as The Howling was, it hadn't been a significant boost for Dante's career. He was struggling a bit at the time, so getting to make Gremlins was an excellent opportunity for him. And while the film was in development, he also got to work with Spielberg on Twilight Zone the movie. The plan was to make Gremlins on the cheap. but it quickly became apparent that the gremlin effects were going to require a good amount of money. Spielberg got the project set up at Warner Brothers and secured a budget of $11 million. Then it was on special effects artist Chris Wallace and his crew to figure out how to bring the Mogwai and gremlins to life. Wallace designed both of the creatures. Dante was hoping that the gremlins would only be 8 or 9 inches tall, but they had to be larger to fit the motors and gears inside the animatronic creatures. Some thought was even given to having monkeys play the gremlins, but that option went out the window when a monkey freaked out when a gremlin mask was placed on its head. So there were animatronics, puppets, marionettes, and for one shot, stop motion. Dante won the debate over the size of the Mogwai. He kept them small, which caused major headaches for Wallace and his team. In the script, the adorable Gizmo, who has some design elements inspired by Spielberg's own dog, exits the picture halfway through. He turns into the evil leader of the Gremlins, Stripe. But late in development, Spielberg decided that Gizmo should stick around and be a heroic sidekick for Billy. It was definitely the right choice for the film, but the effects crew was not enthusiastic about making the little guy look believable in so many more scenes.
Another thing I love about Gremlins, the puppets. They're just perfect. They're from Mogwai all the way to the evil Gremlins, just beautifully designed, beautifully performed. And that's no easy task. I mean, it's one thing when you have a larger puppet, you have a lot of room for mechanisms and everything you need to bring it to life. But these are smaller puppets, and what Chris Wallace did with those puppets in the first film is just astounding. Another thing is Joe Dante knows how to direct practical effects, and clearly he and Chris were communicating well. They were getting the right shots. They were really showing off these puppets in their best light so that you forgot they were puppets. I mean, truly, those things lived. And I think that's one of the things that makes Gremlins so successful, is that you believed that they were real and they were alive. And that's critical to any horror or any genre film. If the creature isn't believable, you lose the audience. And Gremlins is a classic because I think not only is it just a great film, but the Gremlins themselves were executed perfectly. So kudos to Chris Wallace and Joe Dante. Great movie.
The Mogwai and the Gremlins are what draw viewers into the film, but Dante surrounded them with a terrific cast. It seemed that Billy Peltzer's age changed throughout the development process. In the original script, he was a 26-year-old loser. According to Dante, there was another draft where he was just a 13-year-old kid. The film version of Billy ended up somewhere in between, with 19-year-old Zach Galligan winning the role. He got the job primarily due to his chemistry with Phoebe Cates, who plays his coworker and love interest Kate. Folk singer Hoyt Axton plays Billy's dad, an inventor whose inventions didn't work quite as intended. Frances Lee McCain is Billy's mom, who fights off gremlins and gets to keep her head in the movie. The legendary Dick Miller plays Murray Futterman, who introduces the concept of gremlins. Kai Luke plays Mr. Wing, who is caring for Gizmo before the Peltzers get him. Polly Holiday is local real estate agent Mrs. Deagle, an awful woman reminiscent of Wizard of Oz villains. And there are notable appearances from Judge Reinhold and Corey Feldman. And while we're talking about actors, we have to point out that canine thespian Mushroom, as Billy's dog Barney, gives one of the best dog performances out there. But Gizmo and the Gremlins are the true stars. It's mind-blowing to see how much life and personality the crew brought to these creatures. With assistance from voice performers like Howie Mandel, Frank Welker, Michael Winslow, Peter Cullen, and more, it's not difficult to buy into the idea that these are living beings. Sometimes the Gremlins are creepy, sometimes it's hilarious to see them get up to their mischief. And who can watch Gremlins without coming to love and care for Gizmo?
Having fun? Pretty neat, huh?
He's one of the best, most iconic characters of the 80s.
Gosh, it brings out the child in us too. I think that there's adult humor, adult scares to be had, but also the Gremlins were cute. Even the bad ones were.
I think that some of the scenes in the latter part of the film where the Gremlins are really taking over the town are just so evocative of the 50s, the Blob, the Attack of the whatever. They really nailed that energy, and it's scary, but it's always fun.
Making Gremlins was a grueling process. 7 months of pre-production were followed by 3 more months of filming with human actors, with production taking place on Warner Brothers sound stages, the Columbia Ranch, and the Universal backlot. The Kingston Falls Town Square was at Universal, and it's the same town square that was made famous in Back to the Future. While the movie was shot during a California spring and summer, it's set in a snowy winter. There was fake snow being dumped all over the place. Then, once the human actors were wrapped, Dante and crew spent a few more months filming scenes with Gremlins. The effects crew had plenty of time to work with, but money was another issue. The Gremlin effects were so ambitious that they stretched the limits of the $11 million budget, but it all worked out pretty well in the end. The most considerable debate that Dante got wrapped up in didn't even have to do with the creature effects. It was over a monologue that Kate delivers towards the end of the film, when she explains why she hates Christmas. The explanation is a variation on an old urban legend about a father dressed as Santa Claus. He tries to surprise his family by sliding down the chimney, and ends up stuck in the chute with a broken neck. The Warner Brothers executives hated this monologue. It only takes up 2 minutes and comes at around the 80-minute mark of the 106-minute movie. But they thought that it would be the tipping point for viewers. Audiences were going to walk out during this speech. But Dante refused to cut it because he felt that it represented the tone of the entire movie.
The audience doesn't really know whether to laugh or to cry. And that was exactly what I was looking for.
It's humorous and horrifying at the same time. It's funny on the surface, but it wouldn't be funny if it happened to you or your loved ones. The executives even tried to go around the director. Spielberg shared the final cut with Dante, and they asked him to get rid of the speech. He didn't really care for the moment himself, but Dante wanted it there, so he also refused to cut it. The executives didn't give up, not even as prints were being made and sent out to theaters. They asked Spielberg for permission to have the speech physically removed from theatrical prints. Again, he refused. The monologue stayed in, and now we all know why Kate hates Christmas. Sporting a memorable score by Jerry Goldsmith that perfectly captures the gleeful madness of the title characters, Gremlins reached theaters on June 8, 1984, the exact same day that the supernatural comedy Ghostbusters was released. Even with Spielberg's name attached, Gremlins couldn't overcome the appeal of seeing Bill Murray bust ghosts. But the film held its own. It opened in second place with $12.5 million, just $1.1 million behind Ghostbusters in the top spot. And it stuck around in theaters for nearly 6 months. By the end of its run, it had earned nearly $150 million domestically, making it the 4th highest grossing film of the year, coming in behind Beverly Hills Cop, Ghostbusters, and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Some parents thought that it might be something along the lines of E.T., and when we're introduced to Gizmo, it seems like it could be. Then the Gremlins arrive around the 45-minute mark and the story takes a swerve that some viewers weren't expecting. Suddenly we have a murdered science teacher, an attacked mother, Gremlins are being stabbed and microwaved. So yeah, we can see why some felt that they should have been warned about this content ahead of time. As Dante told the Associated Press, the idea of taking a 4-year-old to see Gremlins, thinking it's going to be a cuddly, funny animal movie, and then seeing that it turns into a horror picture, I think people were upset. They felt they had been sold something family-friendly, and it wasn't entirely family-friendly. The concern over whether or not young kids should watch Gremlins clearly didn't extend into my own household. I saw this movie at such a young age, I don't even remember my first viewing of it. It was just always around, showing on cable or rented on VHS. Members of my family were probably watching it with me in the room before I could even speak. But it was never too terrifying for me to handle. I could see there was meant to be a funny edge to everything the Gremlins were doing, and I enjoyed watching Gizmo just as much as any other character in the more kid-friendly entertainment that I was taking in. A lot of the merchandising was aimed towards kids as well. There were pajamas with Billy and Gizmo and children's books about the Mogwai and the Gremlins. You could turn your whole bedroom into a celebration of Gremlins with bed sheets, sleeping bags, and curtains, and carry the obsession to school with you with your Gremlins backpack and lunchbox. I didn't have any of those at the time, but now I really wish I did. Something else that endures to this day is a strong appreciation for Gremlins. The film has many fans who adore Gizmo and love watching the antics of the Gremlins. For many of us, this is a movie we've been fans of since childhood, and it's still entertaining to us decades later. Gremlins was popular enough to receive a sequel and an animated prequel, but it takes an oddly long time for these other projects to come together. A lot of us have been left wishing for more entries in the franchise, and it is shocking that we still haven't gotten a proper Gremlins 3. This is a series that hasn't been as prolific as it could have been, but while some feel we're lacking sequels, at least we'll always have the original film to watch, with all the joy, laughs, and creepiness that comes with it. What do you think of Gremlins and the fact that it was released with a PG rating? Do you have memories of watching the movie as a kid? And do you think that you should have been older when you first watched it? Leave a comment and share your memories of this 80s classic.
I think for me personally, it kind of was a reflection on humanity. We might look similar, but some of us tap into our evil side, some of us tap into our good, cute side. And it's our choice every day to make that. We have all the colors within us. Which paint palette are we going to dip our brush into that day? The good one that's the wholesome, or the one that might have evil intentions?
Ghostbusters, coming to save the world this summer.
We're ready to believe you.
Personally, as an actor, I got inspired in my early years by comedies, sitcoms, variety shows, anything that made me laugh. Jerry Lewis movies, Danny Kaye movies. But so when looking at a fantastical, scary movie with supernatural elements in it, like Ghostbusters, if you infuse laughs in that, you have me hooked.
I love Ghostbusters. Who doesn't love Ghostbusters? It's hilarious. It's also kind of scary.
The story behind Ghostbusters began far earlier than 1984 and would start with writer and star Dan Aykroyd's great-grandfather, Samuel. He was a dentist who used hypnosis in his treatment of patients. This led him to examine whether hypnosis could be used to speak with the dead. In the early 1900s, he began conducting seances and would do so up until he died in 1933. These seances would have that familiar slime element, ectoplasm, sometimes be produced. Throughout his own paranormal career, Sam Aykroyd held around 80 seances with varied results that included visitations from spirits spanning from many different times, including ancient Egypt and China. When Sam passed away, his son Maurice, Dan's grandfather, and Dan's father Peter would continue to attempt communication with the spirit world. Much like Egon and Ray, not so much Venkman, Maurice and Dan would work creating an apparatus that would allow them to contact the spirits. They sadly never succeeded in this, but based on the number of movies where people did achieve that and how those turned out, it was probably for the best. Peter kept going through with his interest and investigating the paranormal. He built a pretty extensive library based around his grandfather's work and books on the subject, which would feed a young Dan's love of the paranormal and an obsession shared by others in his family, like that of his grandfather, whose journals were an inspiration for a little script he was working on back in the early 80s. Aykroyd's background with spiritualism had already given him part of the core of Ghostbusters, but it was while reading a quantum physics and theoretical physics book that set the science side of that film in place. What if you could trap a ghost? How would that even work? The idea blew up like an overfull containment unit. Dan Aykroyd began writing the script with specific actors in mind for the roles. This would consist of hot young comics of the day, who had co-starred with him on SNL and other feature films. John Belushi would play the role of Venkman, and Eddie Murphy would be Winston. In this version of the film, Belushi's role would be slightly different than what it would eventually become, and Winston would have a much more significant role to play. He would also have a background in the military. For those who weren't born or aware back then, I can't stress enough how big of a deal the cast of SNL and comics like Eddie Murphy and John Belushi were. Eddie Murphy was one of the decade's biggest and most controversial comics. He was a stand-up comic rock star and had a massive HBO special under his belt with Delirious. And in 1987, a motion picture stand-up concert was released called Eddie Murphy Raw that would rake in $50 million. He was huge. And when Aykroyd was writing the film and planning to cast him, he came off 2 hits with 48 Hours and Trading Places. John Belushi was one of Aykroyd's fellow original not ready for primetime players on SNL from the beginning. He was a wild man when it came to performing and in life. Some of the most iconic characters to come out of the original run of SNL were thanks to Belushi. Most notable would be Jake and Elwood, the Blues Brothers, which he'd do with Aykroyd and would give Belushi an excellent opportunity to show his dancing skills as well as his singing. Fans had already seen Belushi show that he could stretch from the small screen to the big one, with massive hits like Animal House and the feature film version of the Blues Brothers. The thought of these 3 joining forces to make a massive intergalactic ghost-fighting epic was mind-blowing. The kicker was that Aykroyd's idea wasn't even supposed to be comedic, and was way more serious and played more like a horror and sci-fi film. But it would turn out that this just wasn't meant to be the path that Ghostbusters would travel, and it would change course with a massive loss to Aykroyd and the rest of the world. Dan Aykroyd said that he was writing the script and had just finished a line for John Belushi when he got the call in March of 1982 that Belushi was dead at 33. With the loss of John Belushi, Aykroyd went to another SNL vet and friend in Bill Murray, yet another massive comedy star. But with Murray's ad, it would appear that Eddie Murphy wasn't to be part of the team. Murphy picked Beverly Hills Cop to film instead, which would give him a starring role and a major franchise as Axel Foley. You can't blame him for this though, as Beverly Hills Cop would join Ghostbusters in 1984 as one of the top 10 box office earners of the year. Aykroyd would meet with Ivan Reitman to talk about the film, and Reitman would soon squash the original concepts, thinking that it should be way more of a comedy. He also felt that Aykroyd's scope was way too enormous for a studio to agree on, budget-wise. Reitman had experience with comedy and had produced Animal House and Stripes. He also produced interesting horror movies like Shivers, Rabid, and the animated genre hybrid Heavy Metal. Reitman brought in Harold Ramis, who he had worked with before and who knew his way around a script. This led to Ramis also being cast as a Ghostbuster himself. The film would switch gears in a major way, no longer having the futuristic motif that Aykroyd had initially started with, and instead being set in modern times, and following 3 scientists who start up a business due to a shared interest in the paranormal. It was during this time that the filmmakers were looking for someone to take the place of Eddie Murphy. After several black actors were scouted, the filmmakers auditioned Ernie Hudson for the role. It was a major lead then, but a sore spot would happen once filming began. Hudson states that when he got his version of the script after accepting that Winston's role had entirely changed. He'd show up about halfway through the movie, and he no longer had a military background. Winston Zeddemore wouldn't even be shown on the poster, with only Stantz, Venkman, and Spangler represented. The slight would later be rectified in a major way years later, with Winston appearing to be the most successful one ever with a major financial empire and being the one to bring them back to life in Ghostbusters Afterlife. He'd also be the boss in the new video game Ghostbusters Spirits Unleashed. Annie Potts would be cast as the Egon-loving and bored-voiced receptionist Janine. Sigourney Weaver would be the way too good for Venkman, Dana, who lives in the possessed apartment. Weaver apparently auditioned by impersonating one of the dog monsters from the film for Reitman, snarls and all, and it got her the part. Rick Moranis would play Louis Tully, her neighbor who can't seem to win until he's turned into a hellhound, a role initially going to go to John Candy. Perhaps the real villain, even more so than Gozer, was the unfortunately named Walter Peck, played by the man that everyone seemed to love to hate during the 80s, William Atherton. Fun fact, he won't sign autographs if you ask him to put the caption, "Yes, I have no dick." Trust me on this one. The film got a budget of around $25 million, and Reitman would also direct it. The script, after being retooled by Aykroyd, gave a glimpse to the team before they donned their jumpsuits. The characters were endearing and sarcastic, at least in Venkman's case, and showed that science and smarts could be cool. They weren't perfect heroes, and that's what made them so endearing. The movie was filmed fast, with it being turned around in just 12 months. But something happened that nearly caused it not to hit its summer release date in that magic year of 1984. Back in the 1970s, there was a TV series called The Ghostbusters, a live-action comedy about paranormal detectives who work with a gorilla, played by the legendary Bob Burns. It also starred Forrest Tucker and Larry Stork. The film made a deal with Universal Studios, who owned the original series, allowing it to proceed. Unfortunately, when the spin-off cartoon happened, the two entities crossed streams again. The Ghostbusters, with the gorilla, released a cartoon series as a way to capitalize on the success, and that's why the cartoon based on the movie is called The Real Ghostbusters, so there's no confusion. Although I think that the gorilla would keep that from happening. But the legal troubles of the Ghostbusters movie would not stop there. The hit Who You Gonna Call by Ray Parker Jr. ran afoul of Huey Lewis and the News thanks to its similar sound to I Want a New Drug. It's interesting to note that the offer to make the song for the movie had been offered to Huey Lewis, but they passed due to having already agreed to do the music for Back to the Future. The case was eventually settled out of court, but much like Vanilla Ice and his penchant for Queen, it's hard not to notice that catchy hook sounds so familiar. Those issues aside, Ghostbusters became the #1 film of 1984 and would gross nearly $300 million. The film used mind-blowing special effects, and within the guise of Slimer, or the ugly little Spud, we'd see a little bit of a love letter to John Belushi, who was used as a blueprint for the hungry and naughty ghost. Special effects legend Steve Johnson would design Slimer and would work with the head of effects on the film, Richard Edlund. Some ghosts and spirits would be drawn via sketches by other fantastic fellow artists, including the late Bernie Wrightson.
Terrific effects by Boss Films, led by Steve Johnson, who was at Boss Films at the time. And it's the effects that take that movie to a new level, and they are effects that hold up to this day.
Well, I knew I wanted to be in this world. Since I was 12. I would read Starlog magazine, and I grew up in Texas in a very rural area, so there were a couple of places, little quickie marts that sold Starlog, and the Warren magazines, Eerie, Creepy, Vampirella, that kind of stuff. So I cut my teeth on this stuff, and I knew from the time I knew how to read and write, basically, that I wanted to make monsters.
Kids and adults alike loved Ghostbusters. The film not only celebrated science nerds, but made them the heroes. The everyday Joes of the paranormal were going to go ahead and save the day. There's a sweetness to it. And that's not the marshmallow.
But we cannot forget, really, the Godzilla of that film, the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. Come on!
When you see the guys decide, well, if we're going to go out, I'll see you on the other side, Ray. The car was neat, the proton packs were excellent, and it made a young kid who loved ghosts think that maybe they could hunt for them too. While the film dominated 1984, we wouldn't see toys until a couple of years later when the real Ghostbusters cartoon started. But man, those toys rocked. I had a few of them, and yes, I still have them. Don't judge me. And almost every 80s kid will remember that sweet taste of high-C ecto-cooler that came along with it. I wasn't one of the lucky ones who got to see this one in theaters though. I experienced Ghostbusters on VHS, as would a number of kids. I remember thinking how I'd never seen anything like it before. I loved how the Ghostbusters were science, paranormal, and mythology nerds, just like I was. I started young. They weren't the regular heroes. They were snarky, goofy, smart, and fun. I particularly loved Egon. There was just something that Harold Ramis brought to that character that really stuck with me. Sort of like Mr. Spock, another favorite of mine. Egon would be unemotional most of the time, but you'd see these little moments where there'd be a twinkle in his eye. It was sweet. Where Venkman was sarcasm and Ray was all excitement, Egon was the stoic intellectual with the heart of gold. Egon ruled, and I have no problem saying that he was my favorite. When it came time for another cartoon series, it would be Egon who would show up from the original crew to lead the new recruits in Extreme Ghostbusters. So I guess I wasn't the only one that was partial to him.
that if we can laugh about it along the way, I can keep clearing my head to get on to the next step. And the Ghostbusters, all 4 of them kept us going with that along the way. Solutions, weapons, laughter. Good combination.
Ghostbusters would keep growing in popularity over the years, along with a sequel and cartoon. It would also span comic books and video games. And it wouldn't surprise anyone if they found out that the number of paranormal ghost hunters you see all over TV these days didn't grow up watching it, and therefore get the bug for busting. Over the years, much like Star Wars fans, teams like the Real Ohio Ghostbusters have been created by fans. These groups will do charity events and raise money for causes while showing off their gear and iconic jumpsuits. And sometimes that gear is so good that the films actually ask them to create props for the latest movie. This was indeed a family affair from the start. Beyond the inspiration from Dan Aykroyd's family history of investigating the paranormal was Ivan Reitman and his son Jason, who would take over the reins of writing and directing with 2021's Ghostbusters Afterlife. The film would beautifully illustrate the importance of and longevity of family and friendship, and be a fantastic tribute to the late great Harold Ramis, who helped shape the universe into the one that we love. I bawled my eyes out, okay? That's what I'm saying. Ivan and Jason would be on set for the film together, working, as Ivan would also produce the project. Sadly, though, Ivan Reitman passed away only a few months after the film's release. It would also be revealed that Reitman would actually do some of the motion capture for the Ghost of Egon. The Ghostbusters keep on busting, and there's a new film on the way that's continuing the legacy that started way back in 1984. 1984 was a magic year for movies and monster kids, but it gave us a new way to look at the things that spook us. We could laugh at them, scream, or look them in the eye, and if we were fortunate, we just might get slimed. Ghostbusters was a whole new mythology and world for fans like me. We'd all want a protein pack of our own and a pet Slimer to feed hot dogs too. I wanted to slide down a fire pole and slam on the siren of the Ecto-1. Heck, who doesn't own a shirt with the logo on it? It was a perfect mesh of gadgets, scares, comedy, and a world where anyone could become a Ghostbuster. I mean, if you could tell the guys on screen were living a little bit of a childhood dream come true, think about all of us 80s kids watching it happen for the first time.
From Wes Craven, director of The Hills Have Eyes and Last House on the Left, a new masterpiece in fantasy terror, Nightmare on Elm Street.
By 1984, you think you've seen all that slasher films have to offer. Everyone has copied Halloween to death already, and the formula was very simple. Until he came along.
Nightmare on Elm Street, the movie that changed a lot of filmmakers' lives and careers.
A Nightmare on Elm Street didn't just get under your skin, it was crawling under your sheets and diving deep into your dreams. Wes Craven had found the one place that you have felt safe and exploited it. Nightmare went from a movie that almost wasn't made to an international success, spawning a slew of bizarre and entertaining sequels, with some of the most imaginative kills ever witnessed.
Truly nightmarish concept beneath it that just delves into all your deepest fears. It's ingenious.
Oh, Freddy Krueger. Who knew that the world would fall in love with a child-murdering pedophile? Weird.
Wes Craven was not new to the world of horror. He had previously shocked everyone with his penchant for deviant behavior in The Last House on the Left and The Hills Have Eyes. While Craven was known to us genre fans, it wouldn't be until A Nightmare on Elm Street that he would be a household name. In 1984, arguably one of the best years for all things pop culture, we were catapulted onto a legendary trajectory of greatness in the entertainment scene, which would indeed shape future generations. Where does one even begin?
Welcome to America's favorite answer and question game, Jeopardy!
We were given bangers like Jump, Thriller, and When Doves Cry, while CD players became a thing. TV had everything from the A-Team to Inspector Gadget.
Where's the beef?
It's right here, my dude. I talk a lot about how everything weird, creepy, and macabre shaped me. Nightmare on Elm Street put everything that I had sought out into one film. When I was little, I had truly bizarre dreams that somehow would still follow me into adulthood. You go to the movies to escape what's scary about life. It's an easier way to face your fears and somehow subconsciously practice the art of courage. Nightmare was the first time I had put myself in the driver's seat to experience the worst of the worst. Really, that was by Wes's own design. One part encounters an ominous character, and the other part is based on a set of stories straight out of the times. While the idea of exploring dreams and nightmares in horror had already been done beautifully in The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and even Eyes Without a Face, this was something new, a supernatural, malevolent entity who could kill a person in their dreams was a unique and chilling twist on the slasher genre. I mean, everyone has an Elm Street, right?
Every town has an Elm Street.
But you can tell the story of how Nightmare came to fruition without New Line Cinema and Robert Shaye. The ever-ambitious Shaye had scheduled some meetings with younger directors, including Tobe Hooper and Joe Dante, with Wes being unavailable at the time. Shaye decided to call Wes anyway, and Wes was very unimpressed. Shaye persisted nonetheless, especially after hearing Wes's pitch for Nightmare. Wes put Shaye on pause, telling him that other people were reviewing the script. And finally, 9 months later, after no one responded to the script, Shaye got his wish, or Nightmare, for $5,000. You have 32 days and an extremely modest budget, but have to do whatever you can to make it seem like the opposite. Oh boy. Nightmare had the perfect team to make this happen. A cinematographer looking for perfection wearing an eye patch while filming, a talented team of effects artists, and a writer-director who would not settle for anything less than his vision.
It's something that I think was very relatable to anyone. I suffered from night terrors. I suffered from nightmares. And so you again, knew things to be afraid of. Going to sleep. Up to that point, going to sleep felt like a reprieve. It was a chance to reset. And now Wes Craven comes in and says, fuck you in your sleep, meet Freddy Krueger.
Nightmare stuck with you for a billion different reasons. To even evoke the name Freddy Krueger, a perfect image is created in the minds of those who have seen him. His glove adorned with finger blades, the fedora, and a red and green sweater that has been snuck in every nook and cranny within pop culture.
You can run, but you can't hide, bitch!
This is the first image that the film presents us with before the title hits the screen. I remember complete silence in the theater when I first saw it. There wasn't a peep from anyone in the audience until Krueger reached around and grabbed Tina in her dream. What's brilliant about this scene is that it immediately immerses us into the familiar. We've all been there, running down a hallway that feels endless. And you aren't even running right. The mechanics of it are all wrong, but there's just nothing that you can do about it. You're not in control anymore. The idea of being caught in a dream you may not wake up from wasn't entirely new, but it was in this context. Wes had read a string of articles in the Los Angeles Times chronicling survivors of the Cambodia killing fields and their stories of being followed by someone in their dreams. One of these articles in particular had struck a chord in the director due to the rather creepy details. This young man had told his parents several times that he couldn't sleep or something bad would happen to him. This forced him to stay awake any way that he could. When his parents finally convinced him to get some rest, it would be a sleep he would never come out of. The investigators on the scene said that they found sleeping pills and a coffee pot in his closet. What about this man stalking the dreams? This was based on a particular traumatic event from Wes's childhood. When he was about 10 years old, Wes woke from his sleep only to look outside, where his eyes met those of a drunken drifter. The drifter then gave him the most unsettling smile. He felt the joy that this man got from terrifying a child and tearing away at his innocence. This stayed with him for the rest of his life. But that's the essence of Freddy. He is a god.
This is God.
One of the biggest things about Freddy is that he's allowed to have some personality. This is what sets him apart from damn near every slasher at this point. He's not cold and quiet. He's animated, laughing at your pain, and making quips about it.
I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy.
Wes didn't want to obstruct his face for this exact reason, and it paid off beautifully. Englund sort of put it best when he said that Freddy knows what you're afraid of, what's in your underwear drawer or your diary. He knows your weakness and will exploit it. Another thing that makes the movie stand out is the spectacular uniqueness of the kills and imagery created by Craven and the special effects team. For me, this is why Nightmare stands out amongst the slashers before it. Predictability. There was no way anyone could have called what they saw in this film. You have to know that no one saw what would happen with Tina, or even Glenn. This is the one that remains a standout. Well, aside from Freddy himself. If you were to ask someone in the 80s, or even now, the kills stuck with you. Tina fights for her life against Freddy and is thrown around in her room. Glenn gets sucked up into his bed and then blood gushes out in his place and covers the room in red. It was a lot like what we had experienced with the elevator scene in The Shining, but with a bit more intensity. How could your brain even process these things? I mean, who was sick enough to even think of this stuff? But I will tell you, this was some of the most metal shit I had ever seen.
Utterly startling gore scenes. I mean, even today, watching those, they're so horrifically conceived.
The cast, a mix of newcomers and veterans, sold us on the realism of Elm Street. Heather Langenkamp killed her audition with her down-to-earth qualities and a little moment where she makes a claw noise.
Nancy.
Amanda Weiss deserves just as much acclaim as Langenkamp regarding her portrayal of Tina. While her boyfriend Rod, played by Sue Garcia, gets more of the runtime, Tina's scenes stick with you forever. I mean, remember the body bag? Most famously of all the cast was Johnny Depp. Craven was said to have an eye when it came to casting new talent. Depp may have been his greatest find of all. Not only was he a good-looking dude, but he immediately had that on-screen charisma. There's something about him that was mysterious yet also attainable. Now, I do need to do a slight segue. One of the reasons Wes's movies age as well as they do is the choice of young actors and the relatability. You can absolutely identify with the struggle of being in that gray area between childhood and adulthood. Life is way more bumpy, and you are going through this journey of the new and unknown. You don't want to be treated like a kid and want to be seen more as an adult. Nancy is a prime example of this. She takes charge and challenges the adults in her life being headstrong and what she's seeing and experiencing. She's facing the monster head on and refuses to be a victim. We've all had to face our own fears at some point in our lives, and we can see ourselves in someone like Nancy.
You're nothing. You're shit.
I think the thing about Nightmare on Elm Street, and I think the genius of Wes Craven, is just how much it sort of reflects Freudian psychology. I mean, she's literally looking into the mirror saying, it isn't real, and from the mirror comes the very thing that has been haunting her and breaks through.
Back to our cast, John Saxon was the most familiar of all the actors. He had already been acquainted with the world of horror with Dario Argento's Tenebrae and Jeffrey Bloom's Blood Beach. And one of my favorite films of all time, Enter the Dragon, starring the one and only Bruce Lee. Ronnie Blakely, who I adored from the False Prophet episode of Tales from the Dark Side, brings a vulnerability and complexity to Nancy's mom, Marge. Of all the actors here, we have to shine our spotlight on Freddy himself. Portrayed by Robert Englund, all my sci-fi friendlies out there already knew him from his time as Willie on V, which was a far cry from the monster that would make him famous. Englund's chops as a classically trained actor lent him to bring something unique and sinister to his iconic role. When developing who Freddy was, Englund had a few characters in mind. He would exude the swagger of Jimmy Cagney, the eerie presence of Nosferatu, and embody the intricate personas for which Sergio Leone was renowned. Oh, and we can't forget the hat stylings of The Shadow. Charles Bernstein's score was electric due to the film being low budget. The composer was already skilled at creating terrifying atmospheres, having composed scores for The Entity, Cujo, Love at First Bite, and Sweet Kill. Bernstein didn't consider himself much of a horror fan though. He just went off sounds that would scare him and figured it would likely scare others. When discussing scores for horror flicks, Carpenter's iconic Halloween theme is brought up, as well as the However, this one sort of cuts through your senses with a sharp knife. That paired with the lullaby of 1-2 Freddy's Coming for You, it's hard to imagine that any other score could take residence here.
Everything about it, I think, was iconic and perfect.
There shouldn't be any question as to why we're still talking about the legacy that is A Nightmare on Elm Street today. Freddy was a filthy child murderer, as Marge so eloquently puts it, and we treated him like a rock star. Conveniently, Ride the Lightning and this movie happened to be released in the same year. Freddy had everything: a 1-800 number, a VJ spot on MTV, hell, even former President Bush Sr. name dropped him. While Robert Englund dazzles wherever you put him, Freddy will be a role that he can never top, and neither will anyone else. We saw what happened when someone else decided to take the dare, and Freddy is not a role that can be easily replicated. If you haven't already noticed, when the topic of recasting is brought up, there's no substitute. It's always flat out a role that belongs to Englund. Sorry, Kevin Bacon. We also had Wes Craven.
You know, I knew him a little. He wrote an introduction for a graphic novel I did, and we got a chance to talk a few times. But I would say when he was really good, had an ability to get to some very deep, dark, levels of human fear.
When Mick Garris asked Wes what he wouldn't do, he responded saying that he wouldn't show stupidity, lack of imagination, or something someone has done better. He felt this same sentiment for the teens watching his movies, which is why I think he had longevity within the genre. He said many times that kids were smart and that he didn't need to keep up with them in terms of what was cool. All you needed to do was listen. This man's journey into becoming a director was unexpected by all accounts, even his own. Raised in a strict Baptist household with a repressed childhood, only exposed to Disney movies, then later becoming a humanities professor, he had absolutely no intent on making scary movies, but ended up saving the genre later down the road. He wasn't just following the curve, he often shaped and created it himself. Nightmare on Elm Street hits every high note and then some. This was a groundbreaking departure from the slasher genre, blending in psychological elements seamlessly. While the 80s represented a different genre, the standard of what worked then compared to what resonates today has evolved significantly. Modern horror could undoubtedly learn valuable lessons from the Nightmare playbook. It may no longer carry its underdog status, but it's clawed its ways into the annals of cinematic history, leaving an indelible mark that still haunts our dreams.